While I was standing beside my father's freshly covered grave, my phone vibrated inside my black suit jacket. My name is Daniel Carter. I'm 35 years old, and that single phone call exposed the biggest property scam my own family had ever attempted. I stepped away from the mourners and answered. My cousin Ethan didn't even bother pretending to sound sad. "Sorry about Uncle Robert," he said casually. "But since he's gone now, the farmhouse and all 180 acres officially belong to us." Before I could reply, I heard my uncle laughing in the background. My aunt added, "You should probably stop by tomorrow to collect your personal belongings before the demolition crew arrives." I froze. "My belongings?" Ethan chuckled. "Didn't your lawyer call you? You signed everything months ago." My heart skipped. "I never signed anything." "Oh." There was a long pause. Then Ethan laughed even harder. "Guess you'll find out in court." He hung up. Instead of driving home, I made one phone call. 30 minutes later, I walked into my father's lawyer's office. When attorney Michael Brooks opened the property file, his face went completely pale, because the signature transferring my father's land wasn't mine. It belonged to someone who had been dead for nearly 15 years. If you enjoy true stories filled with shocking betrayals, hidden scams, and dramatic courtroom justice, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications, because this story only gets more unbelievable from here. I barely slept that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I kept hearing Ethan's voice repeating the same sentence. "You signed everything months ago." By sunrise, I had already replayed our conversation 100 times in my head. There was only one certainty. I had never signed away my father's property. Not the farmhouse, not the grazing fields, not the old equipment sheds, nothing. Attorney Michael Brooks was already waiting when I arrived at his office just after 8 o'clock. His law firm had represented my family for almost 25 years. He handled my parents' wills, the purchase of our farmland, even the small loan my father took when he expanded the irrigation system 15 years earlier. If anyone knew the legal history of our property, it was Michael. The moment I walked into his office, he closed the blinds and locked the conference room door. Without saying a word, he placed 3 thick folders on the polished oak table. "I've spent the entire night reviewing every filing connected to your father's estate." He slowly removed his reading glasses. "And Daniel, something is terribly wrong." He slid the first document toward me. Across the top were the words, "Warranty deed." According to the paperwork, my father had supposedly transferred all 180 acres into something called Redstone Agricultural Holdings, LLC, 6 months earlier. I frowned. "I've never heard of this company." Michael nodded. "Neither had I." He flipped another page. "The company was incorporated only 8 months ago." Then he pointed toward the ownership section. My stomach tightened. Managing member, Ethan Walker. Secondary members, my Uncle Frank, my Aunt Susan. Every single shareholder was family. Except me. I stared at the papers in disbelief. So they created a company? Then transferred Dad's land into it? Michael sighed. "That's exactly what it looks like." But here's the part that doesn't make sense. He handed me another document. "This transfer required your written consent." I looked down. Near the bottom of the page sat my name. Daniel Carter. Beneath it, a signature. It looked surprisingly convincing. The looping D, the sharp underline, even the way I crossed the T. For a brief moment, I almost questioned my own memory. Then I noticed something impossible. The document claimed I signed it on March 18th. I laughed. Not because it was funny, because I knew exactly where I had been that day. I reached into my phone and opened my calendar. March 18th. I was in Germany. My engineering company had sent me to Munich for a 3-week infrastructure project. I pulled up my passport scans. The immigration stamp showed I had entered Germany on March 12th. I didn't return to the United States until April 2nd. There. I turned the phone toward Michael. I wasn't even in the country. His eyebrows lifted. Interesting. He immediately photocopied my passport pages. Then he reached for another folder. This gets even stranger. Inside were copies of the notarization records. Every property transfer required a licensed notary. According to these papers, the witness was a man named Harold Benson. Michael quietly searched his computer database. Nothing. No active commission. No retired commission. No record of a notary by that name in the entire state. He leaned back slowly. I think someone created a fake notary. Silence filled the room. Then Michael said something that made my blood run cold. Daniel, I don't think this was rushed after your father's death. I think they've been planning this for months. An hour later, we drove to the county recorder's office. The clerk recognized Michael immediately. She disappeared into the archive room before returning with a large stack of certified filings. Every deed, every mortgage, every easement, every boundary adjustment connected to our property. Michael spread them across the public viewing table. One by one, we began comparing signatures. My father's handwriting looked authentic. Mine didn't. Whoever forged it had copied my signature remarkably well. But they made one tiny mistake. I always signed legal documents using my full middle name. Daniel James Carter. The forged deed simply read, Daniel J. Carter. It seemed insignificant, but Michael smiled for the first time all morning. They copied your bank signature. He tapped the page. But every deed you've ever signed through this office includes your full middle name. He opened another folder containing land documents from 5 years earlier. Sure enough, every authentic signature matched perfectly. The forged one didn't. Small mistakes, Michael whispered. Destroy big frauds. Just then, his phone rang. He answered. His expression changed instantly. Repeat that. He listened for nearly 30 seconds without speaking. When he finally hung up, he looked directly at me. The county assessor's office just released next year's development proposal. So? Michael swallowed hard. Your father's land isn't worth £2 million anymore. It's worth nearly $28 million. I stared at him. What? He slid a fresh map across the table. A bold red line crossed directly through our farmland. The state had approved construction of a new interstate highway interchange less than a mile away. Every commercial developer in the county suddenly wanted that land. Everything clicked into place. This had never been about keeping the farm. It had never been about preserving family history. My relatives hadn't stolen a struggling ranch. They had tried to steal one of the most valuable properties in the entire county. And judging by how confident Ethan sounded at the funeral, they believed they had already won. They had no idea their biggest mistake wasn't forging my signature. It was assuming nobody would look closely enough to uncover the truth. Michael Brooks didn't waste a single minute. The moment we left the county recorder's office, he called the county judge and requested an emergency injunction to prevent any transfer of ownership until the authenticity of the deeds could be investigated. If they're planning to sell the land, he said, as he climbed into his SUV, we're racing against the clock. I looked over at him. You think they've already found a buyer? He didn't answer. Instead, he pressed the accelerator. 45 minutes later, we pulled into the parking lot of my father's farmhouse. The place looked completely different. 3 black luxury SUVs were parked beside the old equipment barn. Several men in tailored suits stood near the front porch, studying blueprints, spread across the hood of one of the vehicles. None of them looked like farmers. They looked like investors. One man pointed toward the eastern pasture while another measured distances using a laser device. Michael muttered under his breath. "They're already negotiating." My stomach dropped. The funeral had been less than 24 hours earlier. They hadn't even waited for my father's flowers to wilt. As we stepped out of the truck, Ethan noticed us immediately. Instead of looking nervous, he smiled. "Daniel." He spread his arms dramatically. "I figured you'd show up eventually." Behind him, Uncle Frank folded the blueprints and walked over. "This isn't really the time." Michael stepped forward. "I'm attorney Michael Brooks. I'm representing Daniel Carter and the estate of Robert Carter." The smile disappeared from Ethan's face. "We're in the middle of a private business meeting." Michael calmly held up a certified copy of the injunction request. "So am I." The investors exchanged confused looks. One of them approached us. "Is there a problem?" Michael turned toward the group. "There may be." He deliberately chose every word. "The ownership of this property is currently under legal dispute. Any purchase completed before that dispute is resolved could be declared void." Silence. One investor frowned. "What dispute?" Michael handed him a copy of the deed. "We have substantial evidence that this transfer contains forged signatures." The man's expression changed instantly. He looked at Ethan. "You told us title was clear." "It is," Ethan replied quickly. "He's just bitter because Grandpa left him out." "My father," I interrupted. "It was my father's land." Ethan ignored me. "This is nothing more than a family disagreement." Michael shook his head. "No. It's a potential criminal investigation." The words hit like a hammer. Every investor immediately stepped away from Ethan. One folded his blueprints. Another quietly placed his paperwork back inside a leather briefcase. A third looked directly at Ethan. "You never mentioned forgery allegations." "There aren't any," Ethan snapped. "They're making this up." Michael smiled politely. "Then you won't mind explaining the forged notary." Ethan blinked. "What?" "The notary public listed on your deed." Michael opened his folder. "There is no licensed notary by that name." For the first time, Ethan looked genuinely worried. One of the investors slowly removed his sunglasses. "I've been developing commercial properties for 22 years. He looked directly at Ethan. "And whenever someone forgets to mention forged documents, I walk." He turned toward the others. "We're done here." Within seconds, folders were closed. Blueprints disappeared. SUV doors slammed shut. One after another, every potential buyer drove away, leaving Ethan standing alone in the dust. The moment the last vehicle disappeared down the gravel road, my uncle exploded. He grabbed Ethan by the shoulder. "What did you do?" "I didn't do anything. You said the paperwork was airtight." "It is." "No, it isn't." The two began shouting at each other in the middle of the driveway. Michael quietly watched without saying a word. Finally, he leaned toward me. "People who build scams together usually destroy them together." Just as we were about to leave, an elderly man slowly approached from the neighboring property. I recognized him immediately. Mr. Walter Jenkins. He had lived beside our farm for over 40 years. He removed his cap. "I've been meaning to talk to you, Daniel." I smiled politely. "About what?" He glanced nervously toward Ethan before lowering his voice. "About 6 months ago, I saw something that didn't feel right." Michael immediately opened his notebook. "What did you see?" Walter scratched his chin. "Your father was in hospital recovering from pneumonia. I remember because I brought food over for his dogs." He pointed toward the farmhouse. "One evening, after dark, Ethan and your uncle came here. They weren't alone. There was another fellow carrying what looked like a portable scanner and several folders. They stayed inside nearly 4 hours. My heartbeat quickened. What day was this? Walter thought for a moment. I wrote it down. You did? He nodded. I keep notes on everything around here. My insurance company once told me to document unusual activity after we had equipment stolen. He walked back to his pickup truck and returned with a weathered notebook. Flipping through several pages, he stopped. There. He pointed to the entry. March 18th. The exact same date shown on the forged deed. Walter looked at me. I thought it was strange because your father wasn't even home. Michael slowly closed the notebook. This just became much bigger than property fraud. He looked directly at Walter. Would you be willing to testify in court? The old man didn't hesitate. I've known your father since we were teenagers. If someone stole what he spent his life building, they'll have to answer for it. As we drove away from the farmhouse, Michael's phone rang once again. He answered, listened for a few seconds, then glanced at me. The forensic document examiner has agreed to take the case immediately. He paused before adding quietly, and if the ink on that deed is as fake as I think it is, your cousin's entire scheme is about to collapse. 3 days later, attorney Michael Brooks and I walked into the Arkansas State Forensic Document Laboratory carrying a sealed evidence envelope. Inside were the original property deeds, notarization records, and every supporting document Ethan had filed with the county. Waiting for us was Dr. Rebecca Collins, one of the state's leading forensic document examiners. She had spent nearly 30 years investigating forged contracts, counterfeit wills, and fraudulent land transfers. She greeted us politely before laying the documents beneath a powerful microscope. I don't start with the handwriting, she explained. I start with the paper. For nearly 2 hours, she examined every page without saying much. She measured paper thickness, compared watermark patterns, studied printer toner under ultraviolet light. Finally, she stopped. This is interesting. She slid one of the deeds toward Michael. The county switched official recording paper 18 months ago. Michael nodded. I remember. Dr. Collins looked back at the document. This deed claims it was signed 6 months ago, yet it's printed on the old paper stock that hasn't been issued for nearly 2 years. I frowned. What does that mean? It means someone didn't obtain blank forms through official channels. She carefully turned another page. They printed these themselves. But that wasn't the biggest discovery. Dr. Collins placed the signature page beneath a digital microscope connected to a large monitor. She zoomed in until every tiny ink stroke filled the screen. Look closely. The signature appeared perfectly natural. Until she magnified it even further. Instead of smooth pen pressure, the signature was made up of thousands of microscopic ink dots. Not flowing ballpoint ink. Printer toner. My signature hadn't been written. It had been scanned from another document, digitally copied, and printed directly onto the deed. Michael slowly leaned back. So it isn't even a forged signature. Dr. Collins shook her head. It's an image. Someone copied an authentic signature and pasted it onto this document. She wasn't finished. The notary seal received the same examination. Within minutes, she uncovered another flaw. The embossing is fake. I looked confused. How can embossing be fake? She smiled. Real notary seals compress paper fibers. She handed me another document to compare. Feel this one. I ran my fingertips over the seal. I could feel the raised impression. Then I touched the deed Ethan had filed, completely flat. The seal wasn't embossed. It was simply printed in gray ink. Another forgery. Michael couldn't hide his excitement. This alone destroys the deed. Dr. Collins nodded. Legally, Probably. Forensically? Absolutely. Then her expression became serious. But there's something else. She reached into another evidence folder. The recorder's office also sent me the electronic submission logs. She handed Michael a printed report. According to the county database, the deed hadn't been uploaded from the recorder's office. It had been electronically submitted through a private title agency. Michael immediately recognized the company name, Delta Title Services. I've worked with them before. They're legitimate. So either one of their employees was involved, or someone used their credentials. That afternoon, we drove straight to Delta Title Services. The owner, Linda Harrison, looked genuinely shocked when Michael explained why we were there. She immediately called her IT manager. Within 20 minutes, they had accessed their server logs. Every property submission required an employee login. There it was. The forged deed had been uploaded using the account of Melissa Grant, one of their senior closing officers. Linda looked horrified. Melissa has been on maternity leave for 4 months. Michael narrowed his eyes. So who accessed her account? The IT manager typed rapidly. A map appeared on the screen. The login didn't come from our office. It came from an external IP address. Can you trace it? He nodded slowly. We already have. Everyone in the room leaned forward. The address belonged to a small office building on the edge of town. Michael read the location twice before looking at me. Daniel, does Ethan's construction company still rent space there? I nodded. They've had an office there for years. The room fell silent. Someone hadn't merely forged a deed. They had hacked into a title company's system, stolen employee credentials, submitted fake legal documents, and attempted to steal property worth nearly £28 million. The fraud was growing larger by the hour. As we prepared to leave, Linda stopped us. There's one more thing. She opened an archived file from 6 months earlier. Our receptionist scanned everyone's visitor log that week. She pointed to one name. Ethan Walker. Purpose of visit. Title consultation. Date. March 17. 1 day before the forged deed was supposedly signed. Michael slowly closed the file. He wasn't asking questions. He was studying their process. As we walked toward the parking lot, Michael's mobile phone rang. He answered, listened for less than a minute, then stopped walking. His face turned pale. What happened? I asked. He looked directly at me. The sheriff's department just executed a search warrant at Ethan's office. He swallowed hard. They've already found a commercial printer, blank deed templates, and what appears to be dozens of property files belonging to other families. My heart sank. This wasn't just about my father's land. Michael nodded grimly. No, I think your family has stumbled onto a much larger fraud operation. The news spread through our county faster than I expected. By the next morning, everyone seemed to know that sheriff's deputies had spent nearly 6 hours inside Ethan's office, carrying out boxes of computers, filing cabinets, external hard drives, and stacks of property records. I assumed the investigation would remain focused on my father's land. I was wrong. Attorney Michael Brooks called me just after 9. Daniel, he said quietly, I need you at my office. Did they arrest Ethan? Not yet, but they've uncovered something far worse. When I arrived, 2 detectives from the Sheriff's Financial Crimes Division were already sitting inside the conference room. One introduced himself as Detective Laura Mitchell. The other was Detective Ryan Hayes. Neither smiled. Detective Mitchell opened a thick binder filled with photographs. We executed yesterday's warrant expecting to investigate one forged deed. She paused. We found evidence suggesting this operation has been running for nearly 3 years. She turned the first page. Each photograph showed a different property file. different owners, different addresses, different counties. There weren't 5 files, or 10. There were dozens. My stomach tightened. How many? Hayes answered. So far. 43. The room fell silent. Michael slowly adjusted his glasses. 43 forged transactions? Detective Mitchell nodded. Not all completed. Some were only prepared. Others were waiting to be filed. She slid another photograph across the table. The image showed shelves filled with color-coded folders. Every folder had a surname written across the spine. Johnson, Miller, Baker, Henderson, Williams. Each family had their own file, their own paperwork, their own forged documents. It looked less like a construction office, and more like the archive room of a criminal organization. Then Detective Hayes revealed something none of us expected. Ethan wasn't choosing random properties. He handed us a printed spreadsheet. Each owner shared one thing in common. They were elderly. Some lived alone. Others had recently lost a spouse. Several had moved into assisted living. Many hadn't visited their land in years. They specifically targeted owners who were unlikely to notice paperwork being filed. Michael looked horrified. They were hunting vulnerable people. Hayes nodded. And your father wasn't their first target. Then Detective Mitchell placed another document in front of me. This one may be difficult to look at. It was an internal email recovered from Ethan's office computer. The sender, Ethan Walker. The recipient, my Uncle Frank. The subject line read, "Easy targets." I felt sick before I even started reading. Inside was a list of property owners. Next to each name were handwritten notes. Children live out of state. No surviving spouse. Poor eyesight. Memory issues. Rarely visits property. The final note beside my father's name read, Daniel works overseas. Perfect timing. I couldn't breathe. They hadn't simply stolen land. They had studied our lives. They knew I traveled frequently for work. They knew my father had recently been ill. They knew exactly when our family would be distracted. Everything had been planned months in advance. Detective Mitchell spoke softly. We believe they monitored obituary notices. I looked up. What? They searched newspapers every morning. When someone elderly became seriously ill, they checked property ownership. My chest tightened. So Dad's illness made him a target? She nodded. That's our current theory. Then Michael asked the obvious question. Where did they learn how to do all this? Detective Hayes opened another folder. We think we've found the answer. Inside was a certificate. It belonged to Ethan. 2 years earlier, he had completed a 6-month online course in real estate closings and title processing. Not because he planned to become a title agent, because he wanted to understand exactly how deeds moved through the system. He had learned every step, every document, every weakness. Then he built a scam around it. Before leaving, Detective Mitchell gave us one final update. The district attorney has frozen every asset connected to Redstone Agricultural Holdings. No money can move. No land can be sold. No bank accounts can be emptied. For the first time since my father's funeral, I finally felt a small sense of relief. Maybe justice really was catching up to them. That evening I drove back to the farmhouse. The sun was setting behind the western fields my father had spent 40 years cultivating. As I stood beside the old fence line, I remembered something he used to tell me when I was a teenager. Land remembers who cared for it. At the time, I thought he was talking about farming. Now I understood. He was talking about integrity. You could forge signatures, create fake companies, print counterfeit deeds, even fool investors. But eventually, The truth always found its way back to the people who had earned it honestly. I stood there in silence until my phone rang. It was Michael. His voice sounded unusually tense. "Daniel? The FBI just contacted the sheriff's office." I frowned. "The FBI?" "Yes. They've linked Ethan's computer to property fraud investigations in 3 other states." He paused before delivering the sentence that changed everything. "This isn't a local scam anymore. It's becoming a federal case." The next morning, I arrived at Michael Brooks's office before sunrise. The lights were already on. 2 unfamiliar black SUVs were parked outside. Neither had county license plates. Inside the conference room sat 3 people I'd never seen before. 2 men in dark suits, and a woman wearing a navy blazer with a small gold badge clipped to her belt. Michael stood as I entered. "Daniel, they're with the FBI." The woman extended her hand. "Special Agent Emily Ross." She didn't waste time with small talk. "We've been investigating an interstate property fraud network for nearly 18 months. She opened a laptop and projected a map onto the conference room wall. Red dots covered multiple states: Arkansas, Missouri, Oklahoma, Tennessee, Louisiana. There are currently 72 suspicious property transfers under investigation. My eyes widened. 72? She nodded. And after yesterday's search warrant, we believe your cousin may be one of the organizers. Agent Ross zoomed into Arkansas. Dozens of highlighted properties appeared across the screen. Some were farms, others were timberland, a few were commercial buildings. Every one of them shared the same pattern: older owner, valuable land, minimal day-to-day activity, little family oversight. It wasn't random, it was a business model. Then another agent, Mark Sullivan, slid a thick evidence binder across the table. This came from Ethan's office computer. Inside were spreadsheets unlike anything I'd ever seen. Each property had been given a color-coded status: green, owner vulnerable; yellow, documents being prepared; orange, signature acquired; red, property ready for sale. My father's farm was marked bright red. Estimated resale value, £28 million. Projected profit, £9.4 million. I stared at the number. To Ethan, our family home wasn't a lifetime of memories. It was a line on a spreadsheet. Special Agent Ross continued. The fake construction company was never the real business. It was simply a front. She opened another folder. Money from previous land sales had been moved through 6 different shell companies before eventually reaching offshore investment accounts. Each transaction was carefully disguised as consulting fees, equipment purchases, or development expenses. Someone had designed the operation to survive routine audits. "This wasn't amateur fraud," Michael muttered. "No," Agent Ross agreed. "Someone with legal knowledge helped build it." The room fell silent. Michael finally asked the question everyone was thinking. "Do you know who?" Agent Ross exchanged a quick glance with Agent Sullivan. "We have a strong suspicion." She placed a photograph on the table. It showed a sharply dressed man leaving a courthouse. His face immediately looked familiar. I had seen him several times growing up. "That's," Michael interrupted quietly, "Gregory Lawson, one of the county's most respected real estate attorneys. He had handled commercial developments for decades." I looked at Michael. "He knows every property law in the state." Michael nodded. "And that's exactly why this is terrifying." According to the FBI, Gregory Lawson had never appeared directly on any forged paperwork. His fingerprints were nowhere. His signature appeared nowhere. Everything had been carefully insulated. But phone records told a different story. Over the previous 18 months, Lawson and Ethan had exchanged more than 400 phone calls, many lasting over an hour, some occurring minutes before forged deeds were submitted, others immediately after fraudulent land sales closed. Agent Ross folded her hands. "We're not ready to charge him, but we're watching him very closely." As the meeting ended, another call came into Agent Ross's phone. She answered, listened, then thanked the caller. When she looked back at us, her expression had changed. "The forensic accountants have finished tracing the money." Michael leaned forward. "And? The proceeds from your father's land weren't meant to stay in Arkansas." She pointed to a banking report. Within 48 hours of the planned sale, more than £8 million would have been transferred overseas. By the time anyone realized the fraud, the money would have disappeared through foreign accounts beyond easy recovery. They hadn't just planned to steal the farm. They planned to vanish with the money forever. That afternoon, deputies escorted Ethan from the county courthouse after another round of questioning, for the first time since my father's funeral. He no longer looked confident. The expensive suit he'd worn only days earlier was wrinkled. Dark circles hung beneath his eyes. Television cameras followed him down the courthouse steps. Reporters shouted questions. "Did you forge the Carter deed? Were other families targeted? Is this connected to the federal investigation?" He ignored every one of them. Just before climbing into his lawyer's car, he looked directly at me across the parking lot. For several long seconds, neither of us spoke. Then he smiled. Not the confident smile he'd worn before. A cold, desperate one. As the car pulled away, Michael quietly said, "That isn't the smile of someone who thinks he'll win. It's the smile of someone who's afraid someone else will talk first." I frowned. "What do you mean?" Michael looked toward the disappearing sedan. "In scams this large, there's always one person higher up. And when prison becomes real, people start making deals." 3 days later, the FBI executed another search warrant. Not at Ethan's office, not at my uncle's house, but at the downtown law firm of Gregory Lawson. And before sunset, every local news station interrupted their regular programming with breaking news. A prominent real estate attorney had been arrested in connection with a multi-state property fraud conspiracy. But as shocking as that arrest was, none of us yet knew that the evidence hidden inside Lawson's office would expose a betrayal even bigger than anyone had imagined. The arrest of Gregory Lawson dominated every local news broadcast for the next 48 hours. For decades, he'd been one of the county's most respected real estate attorneys. He had helped families buy farms. He had overseen commercial developments. He had even spoken at legal ethics seminars. Now, he was being led into federal court wearing handcuffs. But despite the headlines, the investigators still hadn't answered the biggest question. How had the fraud gone undetected for so long? 3 days later, Michael Brooks called me again. "Daniel, I think you should come to the FBI field office. Did they find something?" They found everything. Inside the conference room, Special Agent Emily Ross stood beside a wall covered with photographs. There were pictures of Ethan, Uncle Frank, Gregory Lawson, several title agents, bank managers, accountants, even real estate brokers. Red strings connected nearly every face. This wasn't one family committing fraud, Agent Ross explained. It was a network. She pointed toward Gregory Lawson's photograph. He built the system. Then toward Ethan. "Your cousin found the properties." Another photo. A suspended mortgage broker. He recruited buyers. Another. A corrupt IT contractor. He stole title company login credentials. Every person had a role. Every transaction had been rehearsed. Every document had been designed to survive casual inspection. Then, Agent Ross showed us the evidence recovered from Lawson's office. A hidden fireproof safe. Inside were dozens of encrypted USB drives, thousands of emails, financial ledgers, client files, and one black notebook. Unlike the digital records, this notebook had been handwritten. Every page listed future targets, property values, family situations, medical conditions. Some entries even included personal observations. Lives alone. Children visit only at Christmas. Recovering from surgery. Likely to sell soon. I felt sick. These weren't clients. They were prey. Then Agent Sullivan opened another folder. We found recordings. What kind of recordings? I asked. Meetings. Lawson had secretly recorded strategy sessions with his own partners. Apparently, he didn't trust anyone. One recording had already been transcribed. Agent Ross read a short section aloud. Gregory Lawson's voice was unmistakable. Don't target wealthy businessmen. They hire auditors. Target families. They trust each other. The room fell silent. Then another voice entered the transcript. Ethan, what if one of them notices? Lawson laughed. They won't. By the time they realize what's happened, the land will belong to someone else. Michael slowly closed the transcript. I've spent 35 years practicing law. I've never seen anyone weaponize family trust like this. Agent Ross nodded. Neither have we. Later that afternoon, investigators made another discovery, one that hit me harder than anything else. Among Lawson's files was a folder labeled Robert Carter, my father's name. Inside was a timeline stretching back almost 2 years. Every hospital visit, every insurance claim, every property tax payment, every surgery. Someone had been watching my father long before he passed away. They knew when his eyesight deteriorated. They knew when he was admitted to hospital. They knew when I traveled overseas. Even worse, they knew exactly when my father's life insurance policy matured. This hadn't been an opportunity. It had been a long-term operation. Agent Ross quietly handed me one final document. It was an email from Lawson to Ethan. The message had been sent 4 months before my father's death. Subject: Carter Project. The final sentence read, "Do not move until the son leaves the country again." I stared at the page. My business trip to Germany hadn't been a coincidence. They had waited for me to leave. Only then did they begin preparing the forged paperwork. As the investigation expanded, federal prosecutors started offering plea agreements to lower-level participants. Within a week, 2 title clerks agreed to cooperate. An accountant confessed to creating fake invoices. The IT contractor admitted stealing login credentials. One by one, the network began collapsing, but Ethan remained silent. Until the morning, everything changed. Michael and I were having coffee when Agent Ross called. Ethan wants to talk. What changed? He learned Lawson has agreed to cooperate. Michael looked at me. They're turning on each other, Agent Ross continued. He requested a meeting with prosecutors. He says he can identify everyone involved, if he'll receive a reduced sentence. Michael sighed. It always ends the same way. The people who trusted each other enough to commit crimes never trust each other enough to keep the secret. That evening, every major television station carried another breaking news report. Gregory Lawson had formally pleaded guilty to conspiracy, wire fraud, identity theft, and organized property fraud. As part of his agreement, he surrendered years of financial records, private correspondence, secret bank accounts, and the names of every participant who had profited from the scheme. By sunrise, 6 more arrests had been made. But the biggest battle was still ahead. Because while the criminal investigation was finally exposing the truth, the civil court still had to determine who legally owned my father's land. And the developers who had nearly purchased it were now preparing to fight for millions of pounds in compensation. 6 weeks after Gregory Lawson's arrest, the county courthouse was more crowded than I'd ever seen it. News vans lined both sides of the street. Reporters stood outside the entrance with cameras already rolling. Inside, every seat in the public gallery was occupied. This wasn't just another property dispute anymore. It had become the largest real estate fraud case our county had ever witnessed. But despite everything the FBI had uncovered, today's hearing wasn't about criminal charges. It was about one question: who legally owned my father's land? As Michael Brooks and I entered the courtroom, I noticed Ethan sitting at the opposite table. He looked nothing like the confident man who had laughed at me during my father's funeral. His expensive, tailored suits had been replaced with a plain navy jacket. He had lost weight. Dark circles surrounded his eyes. For the first time, he looked scared. Behind him sat Uncle Frank and Aunt Susan. Neither of them would meet my eyes. Judge Eleanor Whitmore entered precisely at 9 o'clock. The courtroom rose. Once everyone was seated, she looked over the thick stack of files on her bench. "I understand both parties are ready to proceed." Michael stood. "Yes, Your Honor." Opposing counsel nodded. "So are we." The developer's attorney argued first. He claimed his clients had negotiated in good faith. They had invested substantial time and money preparing the commercial purchase, although the sale had never officially closed. They wanted compensation for their expenses. Judge Whitmore listened carefully before turning toward Michael. "Mr. Brooks?" Michael calmly walked to the center of the courtroom. "Your Honor, my client is the victim of an organized criminal conspiracy." He paused. "The developers may have acted in good faith, but they negotiated with people who never legally owned the land." He held up the original deed. "This document has already been declared fraudulent by state forensic experts." Then he presented Dr. Rebecca Collins' report. Every page detailed the forged signatures, the counterfeit notary seal, the fabricated paper stock, and the digitally copied handwriting. The judge reviewed each page carefully. Next came the testimony that changed the atmosphere completely. Walter Jenkins, our elderly neighbor. He slowly walked to the witness stand. After taking the oath, Michael asked only a handful of questions. "Mr. Jenkins, did you observe unusual activity at Robert Carter's farmhouse on the evening of March 18th? "I did." "Who did you see?" "Ethan Walker, Uncle Frank, and another man carrying office equipment." "What was unusual about that evening?" Walter looked directly at the jury. "Robert wasn't home. He was still in hospital. So nobody had permission to be inside that house." The courtroom fell silent. Then came the forensic expert. Dr. Rebecca Collins explained every detail with remarkable patience. She enlarged the forged signature on a courtroom monitor. Even from the back of the gallery, the microscopic printer dots were visible. "This was never written by hand," she explained. "It was reproduced electronically." Opposing counsel attempted to challenge her findings. She answered every question calmly. Every technical explanation strengthened her conclusions. By the time she stepped down, there was little left to dispute. Then the judge looked toward Ethan. "Mr. Walker, do you wish to testify?" his attorney whispered urgently. But Ethan slowly stood anyway. "I'd like to explain." The courtroom became perfectly still, for several seconds. He said nothing. Then he looked directly at me. It wasn't supposed to go this far. Michael remained expressionless. Judge Whitmore leaned forward. "What exactly wasn't supposed to go this far?" Ethan swallowed. The plan was only supposed to convince Daniel to sell. I frowned. What? Ethan continued. We thought if he believed the paperwork was legitimate, he'd accept a settlement, take some money, and walk away. Michael immediately spoke. So the forged deed wasn't the final objective? Ethan hesitated, then quietly answered. No. The courtroom erupted into whispers. Judge Whitmore struck her gavel. Order. Michael seized the moment. So you knowingly participated in preparing false legal documents? Ethan closed his eyes. Yes. And you knew the signatures were fraudulent? Yes. And you attempted to transfer property you did not legally own. A long silence filled the courtroom. Finally, he whispered. Yes. Uncle Frank buried his face in his hands. Aunt Susan began crying quietly. Even Ethan's own attorney looked stunned. Months of denials. Gone in less than 2 minutes. Judge Whitmore called a short recess. When court resumed 30 minutes later, she delivered her ruling. The evidence presented leaves no room for ambiguity. The deed transferring Robert Carter's property is hereby declared null and void. She continued reading. All subsequent transactions based upon that fraudulent deed are likewise void. She looked directly at me. Legal ownership of the Carter property remains with the estate of Robert Carter to be distributed according to his lawful will. For the first time since my father's funeral, I could finally breathe. The land my father had spent 40 years protecting was finally safe. But Judge Whitmore wasn't finished. She turned toward Ethan. Mr. Walker, this court has already reviewed certified copies of your federal plea agreement. She paused. I am therefore referring today's sworn testimony to the United States District Court for consideration during sentencing. Ethan's shoulders dropped. He understood exactly what that meant. His own confession, given voluntarily under oath, would now become part of the criminal case against him. As deputies approached his table, he looked over his shoulder at me one last time. There was no anger left, no arrogance, only regret. Yet the biggest surprise of the entire investigation would arrive just days later, when federal agents discovered something hidden beneath the old Carter farmhouse, something my father had kept secret for decades, and it would change the future of our family forever. The courtroom victory should have felt like the end. Instead, it felt like the beginning of another mystery. 3 days after Judge Whitmore voided every fraudulent deed, I was walking through the farmhouse with Michael Brooks, preparing an inventory for probate. For the first time in weeks, the house was quiet. No detectives, no reporters, no lawyers. Just the familiar smell of old pine wood and coffee that seemed permanently soaked into the walls. As we worked our way through my father's study, Michael stopped in front of an antique oak desk that had been there for as long as I could remember. Did your father ever mention a safe? I shook my head. No. Michael ran his fingers along the underside of one of the drawers. There was a faint click. The entire back panel slid open. Hidden inside was a small steel lockbox. We looked at each other in silence. I've been handling your father's legal affairs for 25 years, Michael said quietly. I never knew this existed. The box wasn't locked. Inside were only 3 items. A leather-bound journal, a sealed envelope with my name written across the front, and a brass key attached to a faded tag. The tag read, Storage Unit 2114, Little Rock Secure Storage. I stared at the envelope for several seconds before opening it. The handwriting was unmistakably my father's. Daniel, if you're reading this, it means I'm no longer here to explain everything myself. First, I need you to know something. I never feared losing my land. I feared losing the truth. My hands began to shake. Michael quietly stepped back, giving me space to read. The letter continued. About 2 years ago, I noticed money disappearing from the business accounts. At first, I blamed myself. I thought age was making me careless. Then I found invoices for equipment I'd never ordered. When I questioned Ethan, he always had an explanation. When I questioned your Uncle Frank, he changed the subject. That was the day I realized someone close to me was stealing. I looked up at Michael. He knew. Michael nodded slowly. It seems he suspected them long before anyone else. The letter revealed something even more shocking. Rather than confronting them immediately, my father had quietly begun collecting evidence. Every suspicious invoice, every bank statement, every canceled check, every unusual phone call. Instead of storing them at the farmhouse, he placed everything inside storage unit 2114. He was building his own case, Michael whispered. Within an hour, we arrived at the storage facility on the outskirts of town. The manager checked the records. Unit 214? He smiled politely. Yes. Mr. Carter paid for that unit every year. No one else ever accessed it. He handed me the key. As the heavy steel door rolled upward, dust drifted through the afternoon sunlight. The unit wasn't filled with furniture or machinery. It contained rows of neatly labeled archive boxes, each marked by year, each carefully organized. My father had documented everything. Michael opened the first box. Inside were dozens of folders. The labels immediately caught his attention. Equipment payments, supplier contracts, property taxes, authorized signatures. Then he stopped. Near the bottom sat another folder. The label simply read, "If anything happens to me." Neither of us spoke. Michael carefully lifted it onto a folding table. Inside were photocopies of identification documents, photographs, USB drives, and handwritten notes. My father hadn't merely suspected fraud, he had anticipated it. Then Michael discovered the document that stunned us both. It was a certified letter dated almost 18 months earlier, addressed to Gregory Lawson. My father had written, "I am aware that someone is attempting to manipulate ownership records concerning my property. Any future transfer of my land without my direct written confirmation should be treated as fraudulent." The letter had been sent by registered mail. Michael examined the receipt. Lawson had personally signed for it. "He knew," Michael whispered. "Gregory Lawson knew your father was suspicious. That explained everything. Why they had rushed the scheme after my father's health began declining. Why they waited until I left the country. Why they pushed so aggressively after the funeral. They knew time was running out. If my father ever handed those boxes to law enforcement, their entire operation would collapse." Then I opened the final archive box. Inside was an old photograph. It showed my father standing beside the farmhouse nearly 30 years earlier. Next to him stood Gregory Lawson. They were smiling, shaking hands. I looked at Michael. They knew each other? Michael sighed heavily. Better than that. They were business partners, decades ago. I stared at him. What? Michael nodded. Before Lawson became a lawyer, he helped your father purchase this land. Everything suddenly made sense. Gregory Lawson didn't choose our property by accident. He knew its history, its value, its legal weaknesses. He even knew where every original boundary survey had been filed. He wasn't targeting a stranger. He was betraying an old friend. As we packed the evidence back into the archive boxes, my phone rang. It was Special Agent Emily Ross. "Daniel, you need to come to the federal courthouse." "What happened?" She paused. "We've just recovered another encrypted hard drive from Gregory Lawson's office." "So?" "It contains a list. A list of every property they intended to steal over the next 5 years. I frowned. How many? Her answer left me speechless. 112. Then she added something that sent a chill down my spine. And your father's farm was listed as only the first phase. The following morning, I walked through the security checkpoint at the federal courthouse with attorney Michael Brooks beside me. Special Agent Emily Ross was already waiting outside a secure evidence room. She looked exhausted. Dark circles framed her eyes, and a stack of files rested under one arm. "You won't believe what our cyber team recovered," she said quietly. She swiped her access card, and the heavy steel door clicked open. Inside, a large monitor displayed the contents of Gregory Lawson's encrypted hard drive. Thousands of folders filled the screen, each one labeled with a county name. Each county contained dozens of individual property files. It was an organized catalog of stolen futures. Agent Ross opened one spreadsheet. At the top was a title that made my stomach turn: 5-year acquisition strategy. There was nothing subtle about it. The document listed more than 100 properties spread across 4 states. Each property included estimated market value, owner's age, health concerns, family situation, probability of legal resistance, expected resale profit. It wasn't just fraud. It was a business plan. Michael slowly removed his glasses. "I've prosecuted civil fraud for 30 years. I've never seen anything this calculated." Agent Ross nodded. "Neither have we." She clicked another file. Next to several names were handwritten notes. Recently widowed. Children live overseas. Early signs of dementia. Likely nursing home placement within 12 months. I felt sick. They weren't simply stealing land. They were waiting for vulnerable people to lose the ability to defend themselves. Then Agent Ross stopped scrolling. There, she enlarged another folder. Carter Project, Phase 1. Inside was an internal memo written by Gregory Lawson. Secure title immediately after Robert Carter's death. Sell development rights within 60 days. Transfer proceeds through offshore holding company. Expand into neighboring farmland after acquisition. I frowned. Neighboring farmland? Agent Ross nodded. They never intended to stop with your father's property. She zoomed out to reveal a county map. Nearly every farm surrounding ours had been highlighted in red. Our land wasn't the destination. It was the starting point. Michael studied the map carefully. If they'd succeeded, they would have controlled nearly the entire Eastern Development Corridor. Agent Ross nodded. And once the new motorway interchange opened, the combined value would have exceeded £300 million. For several seconds, nobody spoke. Now I understood why they had taken such enormous risks. This had never been about greed alone. It was about building a property empire using forged ownership records. Then Agent Ross handed me another folder. "We found something your father never knew." Inside were intercepted emails between Gregory Lawson and a commercial developer from another state. One message stood out: "Acquire parcels quietly. Avoid public bidding. Families create emotional complications." Forged transfers are significantly cheaper. Michael shook his head. They weren't waiting for desperate sellers. They were eliminating sellers entirely. Just then, another agent entered the room, carrying fresh paperwork. He leaned over and whispered something into Agent Ross's ear. She looked genuinely surprised. "What happened?" I asked. She turned toward us. "Ethan has withdrawn from his plea negotiations." Michael frowned. "Why?" "He says he isn't the mastermind anymore." I blinked. "What does that mean?" Agent Ross placed another photograph on the table. This man. The picture showed someone none of us recognized. Late 50s. Gray hair. Expensive Italian suit. No criminal record. No public profile. The caption beneath the photograph read, Victor Hale, International Investment Consultant. Agent Ross folded her arms. We've traced almost every offshore transfer. They all end here. She tapped Victor Hale's photograph. We believe Lawson answered to him. Michael looked stunned. So Lawson wasn't running the operation? No. He was managing the legal side. Ethan recruited targets. The title insiders handled paperwork. But the money always ended with Victor Hale. The room fell silent once again. For months, investigators believed they were dismantling the organization. Instead, they had only removed the local branch. The real architect had never even appeared in Arkansas. He had simply financed the operation from behind the scenes. As Michael and I left the courthouse that afternoon, reporters surrounded the front steps. Microphones were pushed toward us. Mr. Carter, do you feel justice has finally been served? I paused before answering. No. Justice has started. But the people who planned this are much bigger than the people already under arrest. The cameras kept rolling. Across the street, Agent Ross stepped into an unmarked SUV. Before closing the door, she looked back at me. Daniel, we've just received confirmation. What confirmation? She took a slow breath. Victor Hale boarded a private jet less than 3 hours ago. My heart sank. Where is he going? We don't know. But if he leaves the country, recovering the stolen money could become almost impossible. For the first time since this nightmare began, the investigation had a deadline. Because somewhere above the clouds, the man who had financed years of betrayal was trying to disappear forever. The moment Special Agent Emily Ross told us Victor Hale had boarded a private jet, the atmosphere changed. Up until then, the investigation had been about proving crimes that had already happened. Now, it became a race to stop the next one. Within an hour, Michael Brooks and I were back inside the FBI field office. The operations room buzzed with activity. Agents hurried between desks carrying folders. Large monitors displayed live flight paths, banking records, and surveillance photographs. Agent Ross pointed to a digital map. Victor's aircraft filed a flight plan for the Cayman Islands. But we don't believe that's his final destination. Why not? I asked. She enlarged the route. Private jets often file misleading flight plans. They can stop to refuel, change registration numbers, or continue somewhere else. Agent Sullivan walked over, carrying another folder. We've frozen every domestic account connected to Victor Hale. But the overseas trusts are another story. Then another agent entered the room holding a laptop. We've decrypted another drive. Everyone gathered around. Instead of financial records, the screen displayed video files. Dozens of them, each one labeled with a property address. Agent Ross clicked the first recording. The footage came from a hidden camera placed inside a farmhouse kitchen. An elderly couple sat drinking coffee, completely unaware they were being watched. The date stamp showed the recording had been made nearly a year earlier. I felt my stomach twist. They were spying on people. Ross nodded. They wanted to understand routines. When owners left the house, when relatives visited, whether security systems had been installed. Michael looked horrified. This isn't property fraud anymore. It's organized surveillance. The next video was worse. It showed my father's workshop. The recording had been taken through a window. My father was repairing an old tractor. A timestamp in the corner showed it had been filmed almost 6 months before his death. Someone had been watching him, long before any forged paperwork appeared. I couldn't take my eyes off the screen. He never knew. Agent Ross quietly replied, "No. Then came the discovery that stunned everyone. Hidden inside Victor Hale's encrypted files was a spreadsheet titled Priority Assets, Phase 2. Agent Sullivan opened it. Every property included an estimated acquisition date. Most hadn't yet been targeted. Some belonged to retired teachers, others to veterans. Several were family-owned farms that had remained in the same hands for generations. One note appeared over and over again. Avoid confrontation. Acquire through paperwork only. Victor Hale wasn't interested in stealing land by force. He preferred victims who never realized it was gone until months later. Just after noon, the conference room doors opened. The United States Attorney entered, carrying fresh court documents. We've obtained federal seizure warrants. He looked around the room. If Victor Hale lands anywhere within U.S. jurisdiction, he'll be arrested immediately. For the first time all day, there was a small sense of hope. Then Agent Ross's phone rang. She answered. Her expression darkened. The aircraft has disappeared from radar. The room fell silent. What do you mean disappeared? Michael asked. It landed. Where? They don't know. They don't know. The transponder was switched off after entering international airspace. Hours passed. No updates. No sightings. No banking activity. Victor Hale had vanished. Late that evening, I drove back to my father's farmhouse. The fields were quiet beneath the setting sun. Standing on the porch, I thought about everything that had happened over the past 2 months. The funeral, the forged deeds, the courtroom, the FBI investigation. None of it would have come to light if Ethan hadn't made one mistake. Calling me before checking whether the paperwork had truly worked. His arrogance had exposed everything. As I unlocked the front door, I noticed something unusual. A plain brown envelope had been pushed beneath it. No stamp, no return address. Just my name, written neatly across the front. Inside was a single sheet of paper, printed in black ink. No signature, only one sentence. Your father wasn't supposed to die first. My hands froze. There was another line beneath it. Walk away now, or you'll learn why Victor Hale was never afraid of the FBI. I immediately called Agent Ross. She arrived less than 20 minutes later with 2 forensic technicians. After carefully sealing the letter into an evidence bag, she looked at me with a seriousness I'd never seen before. This changes everything. Why? I asked. She took a slow breath. Because Victor Hale didn't disappear. He wants us to know. He's still watching. Special Agent Emily Ross didn't let anyone touch the envelope. Within minutes, forensic technicians dusted the paper for fingerprints, photographed every angle, and carefully sealed it into an evidence bag. I watched from the porch as they worked beneath the flashing blue lights. The farmhouse suddenly didn't feel like home anymore. It felt like a crime scene. Agent Ross finally walked over. Daniel, has anyone besides Michael Brooks known you were staying here? I thought for a moment. No. What about reporters? I've avoided all of them. She nodded slowly. Then whoever delivered this letter already knew where you were. A chill ran down my spine. They've been watching the house. The FBI immediately installed temporary surveillance cameras around the property, motion sensors, infrared cameras, unmarked patrol vehicles. By midnight, 2 agents were parked less than 200 yards from the farmhouse. I hated it. My father had spent 40 years building this place into a peaceful home. Now it looked like a military checkpoint. The next morning, Agent Sullivan called with the forensic results. No usable fingerprints. No DNA. The paper came from a commercially available printer. I sighed. So nothing. Not exactly. There was one interesting detail. What? The envelope contained microscopic traces of cedar sawdust. I frowned. Sawdust? Fresh cedar. Michael Brooks, who had been sitting across from me, suddenly looked up. Cedar? Agent Sullivan continued. Our lab identified it as Western red cedar. Michael slowly leaned back in his chair. That's strange. Why? He looked at me. Western red cedar isn't processed anywhere near this county. Within an hour, Michael had pulled up commercial shipping records. Only one lumber distribution center within 100 miles regularly handled Western red cedar. Harrison Timber Export Yard. The name immediately sounded familiar. Michael searched another file. Then he froze. Daniel, Harrison Timber. What about it? He turned the screen toward me. The company had recently been purchased through another shell corporation. Guess who signed the acquisition papers? Victor Hale. Agent Ross immediately requested a federal search warrant. By late afternoon, dozens of FBI agents surrounded the sprawling timber yard. It covered nearly 50 acres near the river. Stacks of imported lumber towered over the warehouses. Forklifts moved constantly. On the surface, it looked like an ordinary business, but federal agents weren't there for lumber. They were looking for evidence. The search lasted almost 11 hours. Most of the buildings contained exactly what you'd expect. Shipping manifests, export records, heavy machinery, nothing unusual. Then, just before sunset, one of the agents discovered a locked office hidden behind the main warehouse. The room wasn't listed on any building plans. Inside were 6 computer servers, several satellite phones, and walls covered with county maps. Each map was covered in colored pins: red, yellow, green. Agent Ross called me immediately. Daniel, you need to see this. When Michael and I arrived, agents were already photographing everything. One enormous wall displayed aerial photographs of farms across 4 states. Some had handwritten notes attached. Others contained ownership records, medical histories, property values, exactly like the files recovered from Gregory Lawson's office, except these were current. Victor Hale hadn't stopped planning. He'd simply moved operations somewhere else. Then an evidence technician carried over a small metal box. We found this hidden beneath the floor. Inside were dozens of passports, different names, different nationalities. Every photograph showed Victor Hale. He'd been living under multiple identities. Agent Ross quietly explained. He's been preparing escape routes for years. Just as investigators finished cataloging the evidence, another discovery brought the warehouse to a complete standstill. An agent emerged carrying a thick leather ledger. Unlike the digital files, this one had been handwritten. Across the front cover, embossed in gold letters, were 2 words: Settlement Fund. Inside was page after page of payments, dates, amounts, initials. The first names belonged to title clerks, then surveyors, then mortgage brokers, then judges' assistants. Michael's expression hardened. This wasn't just fraud. It was corruption. The ledger documented years of bribery. People inside the system had quietly accepted money to ignore irregular paperwork. Some looked the other way. Others actively helped. The network had survived because it wasn't operating outside the system. It had infiltrated it. As FBI agents secured the final boxes of evidence, Agent Ross received another phone call. She listened carefully before hanging up. They've identified Victor Hale's aircraft. I stepped forward. Where is he? She looked directly at me. He never left North America. What? The Cayman Islands flight plan was fake. So where did he go? She unfolded a new satellite image. The The private jet had landed, not at an international airport, but on a secluded private airstrip less than 80 miles from our county. Victor Hale hadn't run. He had stayed close enough to keep watching. And somewhere nearby, the man behind the biggest property fraud operation in the region was still free. For nearly 3 months, Victor Hale had always been one step ahead. Every search warrant arrived too late. Every bank account had already been emptied. Every safe house had already been abandoned. It was as though he knew every move investigators planned to make. But this time, the FBI had something he didn't know about: his own arrogance. 2 days after discovering the hidden office at Harrison Timber Export Yard, Special Agent Emily Ross called Michael Brooks and me to the federal field office. The atmosphere inside was different. No frantic agents, no phones ringing non-stop, just quiet confidence. Agent Ross closed the conference room door. "I think we've finally found a way to bring Victor Hale out of hiding." Michael folded his arms. "How?" She smiled. "We're going to make him believe he has one last opportunity." The FBI had secretly leaked a carefully controlled rumor through one of the cooperating suspects. According to the story, a forgotten property file worth nearly £40 million had never been recovered during the warehouse raid. The file supposedly contained ownership documents for several thousand acres of undeveloped land scheduled for a massive industrial project. It was exactly the kind of prize Victor Hale would never ignore. The file didn't exist. It was bait. For 48 hours, nothing happened. No unusual phone calls. No suspicious bank transfers. No movement. Then, just after midnight on Friday, one of the undercover agents received an encrypted message. 3 words: "Arrange the meeting." Agent Ross looked at everyone in the operations room. He took the bait. The exchange was scheduled for Sunday evening inside an abandoned grain terminal along the Arkansas River. The location had been selected by Victor's intermediaries. Old warehouses, hundreds of shipping containers, multiple escape routes. Exactly the kind of place a man like Victor Hale would choose. What he didn't know was that every rooftop, every access road, and every river crossing had already been surrounded by federal agents. I wasn't supposed to be there. Michael insisted I stay away. "This is an FBI operation. You've done enough." I agreed. At least, that was the plan. Sunday afternoon, Agent Ross called unexpectedly. "Daniel, we need your help." I frowned. "Why?" "Victor insists on speaking with the Carter family representative. He believes only you know where the original property records are hidden." Michael immediately objected. "Absolutely not." Ross nodded. "I understand, but we've already prepared for every possibility." She placed a bullet-resistant vest on the conference table. "You'll never be alone." At exactly 7:40 p.m., an unmarked SUV dropped me near the abandoned terminal. An undercover agent walked 20 yards ahead pretending to be my lawyer. Hidden microphones had been sewn into my jacket. Snipers watched from neighboring rooftops. More than 60 federal agents were positioned throughout the industrial complex. The air felt heavy. Every sound echoed across the empty concrete buildings. Then, headlights appeared. A black luxury SUV rolled slowly into the terminal yard. Another followed. Then a third. The engines stopped. The doors opened. 4 men stepped out. 3 were bodyguards. The 4th was Victor Hale. For months, I'd only seen photographs. In person, he looked completely ordinary. Late 50s, gray suit, calm expression. The kind of man you'd never notice walking through an airport. He smiled politely. "So, you're Daniel Carter." His voice carried no anger, no panic, just confidence. I've heard a great deal about you. I didn't answer. Victor glanced around the empty terminal. You've caused me an extraordinary amount of inconvenience. You stole my family's land. He chuckled softly. No. I tried to buy opportunity. Michael had warned me. Victor never described theft as theft, fraud as fraud. Everything became business. Everything became opportunity. He stepped closer. I'll make this simple. Tell me where your father kept the remaining files, and I'll wire 10 million pounds into any account you choose. I stared at him. My father spent his entire life teaching me that some things aren't for sale. Victor sighed. That's unfortunate. He nodded once toward one of his bodyguards. The man reached inside his jacket. Before he could pull out whatever he was reaching for, a booming voice echoed across the terminal. Federal agents. Don't move. Powerful floodlights exploded to life from every direction. The entire yard was suddenly bathed in brilliant white light. Within seconds, armed FBI agents poured from behind containers, warehouses, and vehicles. Victor's bodyguards instinctively reached toward their weapons. Red laser sights instantly covered their chests. Hands where we can see them. Nobody moved. Victor looked around slowly. Then, to my complete surprise, he smiled, not nervously, not desperately, almost knowingly. He slowly raised both hands. I wondered how long it would take. Special Agent Ross stepped forward. Victor Hale, you're under arrest for conspiracy, wire fraud, money laundering, identity theft, and organized property fraud. She began reading his rights. Victor listened patiently, then interrupted her with a single sentence. You've arrested the wrong man. Ross frowned. What? Victor looked directly at me. The person you're really looking for has been standing beside you since the very beginning. My heart stopped. Slowly, every eye in the terminal turned toward Michael Brooks. Michael looked just as stunned as I was. Victor smiled one last time, then calmly held out his wrists for the handcuffs. As agents led him toward an armored vehicle, only one question remained. Was Victor Hale telling the truth, or making one final attempt to destroy the people who had brought him down? The silence inside the abandoned grain terminal was almost unbearable. Victor Hale's final words echoed through the floodlit warehouse. The person you're really looking for has been standing beside you since the very beginning. Every agent instinctively looked toward Michael Brooks. Even I did. For the briefest moment, my heart stopped. Michael stood perfectly still, confused, almost insulted. Special Agent Emily Ross didn't move. She had spent too many years interviewing criminals to react emotionally. Instead, she calmly looked at Victor. Are you making a statement or trying to create reasonable doubt? Victor smiled. You'll find out. As agents escorted him toward the armored transport vehicle, Michael quietly exhaled. I suppose that's one way to thank the lawyer who destroyed your empire. I wanted to believe him immediately. After everything Michael had done, the accusation sounded ridiculous, but Agent Ross wasn't willing to ignore it. She turned toward Michael. I'm sorry, but protocol requires us to verify every allegation. Michael nodded without hesitation. I understand. He removed his wallet, his mobile phone, his office keys, then handed everything to an agent. Take whatever you need. I have nothing to hide. Over the next 48 hours, the FBI audited every case Michael Brooks had handled during the past 25 years. Every client trust account, every property transaction, every estate file, every bank record. They even examined his tax returns. I expected Michael to be angry. Instead, He cooperated with every request. If clearing my name helps finish this investigation, they can have every document I've ever signed. 3 days later, Agent Ross called me. The audit is complete. I held my breath. And? There isn't a single suspicious transaction. She sounded almost amused. In fact, your attorney may be the most thoroughly documented lawyer I've ever investigated. Every client payment matched. Every trust account balanced. Every property closing had been handled correctly. Victor's accusation had failed, or had it. Later that afternoon, Michael and I met Agent Ross at the FBI office. She placed a single folder on the table. Victor lied. Michael smiled faintly. I assumed as much. Ross shook her head. Not entirely. She opened the folder. The person beside Daniel wasn't guilty. She looked directly at Michael. But Victor wasn't talking about you. The room fell silent. What do you mean? I asked. Ross turned another page. It wasn't Michael Brooks standing beside Daniel from the beginning. She slid a photograph across the table. My breath caught. The picture showed Detective Ryan Hayes. The very detective who had been helping investigate the case since the sheriff's office became involved. Michael stared at the photograph. Hayes? Ross nodded slowly. We've uncovered something unusual. She placed several phone records on the table. Throughout the investigation, Detective Hayes had exchanged dozens of calls with numbers linked to Victor Hale's organization. Most occurred late at night. Several happened minutes before federal search warrants were executed. My stomach tightened. Are you saying someone leaked information? Ross nodded. We believe every major raid was compromised. Suddenly, everything made sense. How Victor always emptied his offices before investigators arrived. How bank accounts disappeared hours before they were frozen. How warehouses had been cleaned out just before search warrants were served. Someone inside law enforcement had been warning him. Ross continued. We kept the investigation quiet. We never told Detective Hayes about Victor's accusation. Then we monitored his communications. She slid another report across the table. Less than 2 hours after Victor's arrest, Hayes made 3 encrypted phone calls. Then he drove, not home, but to a remote cabin outside the county. Federal surveillance teams followed him. Inside the cabin, they found 2 laptops, 3 encrypted satellite phones, and nearly 850,000 pounds in cash hidden beneath the floorboards. The next morning, Detective Ryan Hayes was arrested. The charges were staggering: bribery, obstruction of justice, conspiracy, destruction of evidence, money laundering, and aiding an organized criminal enterprise. When reporters asked why he had betrayed his badge, Hayes refused to answer. But investigators already knew. The ledger recovered from Harrison Timber contained his initials beside 18 separate payments. Over 5 years, Victor Hale had quietly purchased the loyalty of the very man responsible for investigating property crimes. That evening, Agent Ross visited the farmhouse. She stood on the porch looking out across my father's fields. I owe you an apology. For what? We trusted Hayes. So did everyone else. She nodded. But because Victor tried to frame the wrong man, he accidentally exposed the right one. For the first time since this nightmare began, it truly felt as though every piece of the conspiracy was finally collapsing. But as Ross prepared to leave, her phone buzzed one more time. And she looked down at the screen, then slowly raised her eyes to meet mine. We've just recovered the final encrypted files from Victor Hale's laptop. I smiled. So this is finally over? She didn't smile back. No. The files contain something we've never seen before. What? She took a slow breath. A list. of people who were still working for Victor. There are 12 names. She paused. And only 7 of them have been arrested. That meant 5 members of the organization were still out there, still free, still unaccounted for. For the first time in months, I thought we were finally at the finish line. Victor Hale was behind bars. Gregory Lawson had pleaded guilty. Ethan had confessed in open court. Detective Ryan Hayes had been arrested for leaking confidential investigations. The network had collapsed, or so we thought. Special Agent Emily Ross placed a thin black folder on the conference table. She looked more serious than I had ever seen her. The encrypted files are complete. Michael Brooks leaned forward. And? Ross slowly opened the folder. There were 37 people involved in Victor Hale's organization. She pointed to the list. 32 have now been identified. She paused. 5 remain unknown. The room fell silent. Each unidentified member was listed only by a code name: Atlas, Mercury, Falcon, Harbor, Kingmaker. No real names, no photographs, no addresses, only encrypted communications. They never spoke directly with Victor, Ross explained. They used anonymous servers, burner phones, and encrypted messaging. Michael frowned. So, how do we find them? Ross looked toward the evidence wall. We start with the money. Federal forensic accountants spent weeks rebuilding thousands of financial transactions. Every payment, every shell company, every offshore account. Eventually, one pattern appeared. Nearly every payment passed through the same investment trust, a company called Northbridge Asset Management. On paper, it looked completely legitimate. It managed commercial property investments across several states, but something didn't add up. The company employed only 3 people, yet it had moved more than £600 million over 6 years. The FBI quietly obtained search warrants. This time, they told almost no one. After Detective Hayes's betrayal, only a handful of trusted agents even knew the operation existed. No local police. No county officials, no advance paperwork. At exactly 5 a.m. on Tuesday morning, federal agents entered Northbridge's headquarters. Employees arrived expecting another normal workday. Instead, they found every entrance blocked by FBI vehicles. By lunchtime, agents had seized every computer, every financial ledger, every encrypted server. The company's chief financial officer was arrested before leaving the building. Unlike Victor Hale, he wasn't prepared. Within 6 hours, he agreed to cooperate. His testimony revealed the identities of 3 remaining conspirators. Atlas was a retired banker. Mercury managed offshore trusts. Falcon specialized in creating fake corporate ownership records. 3 more arrests followed within 48 hours. Only 2 names remained: Harbor, Kingmaker. Weeks passed. Nothing. No sightings. No financial activity. No intercepted communications. It was as though the final 2 had disappeared. Then, late one Friday afternoon, Agent Ross called me unexpectedly. "Daniel, we found Harbor." "Where?" "He never left." "What do you mean?" "He owns the marina where Victor kept his private yacht." Federal agents quietly surrounded the marina before dawn. Harbor surrendered without resistance. Inside his office, investigators recovered another collection of encrypted drives, shipping records, passport copies, foreign bank transfers. Everything pointed toward one final person: Kingmaker. Unlike everyone else, Kingmaker never handled money, never forged paperwork, never contacted victims. According to Harbor, Kingmaker's only responsibility was introducing wealthy investors willing to buy stolen property without asking questions. the organization's rainmaker, its recruiter, its silent partner. Nobody even knew his real name, only that he had attended every major planning meeting. Then one tiny detail changed everything. Among Harbor's records was an invoice for a luxury hotel conference held 4 years earlier. The guest list contained dozens of fake names, but one passport number matched an immigration record. The passport belonged to Victor Hale's younger brother. His real name was Richard Hale. For years, he had hidden behind the codename Kingmaker. While Victor organized the fraud, Richard found wealthy investors eager to profit from stolen land. 3 days later, Interpol located Richard Hale living under another identity in Portugal. A provisional arrest warrant was issued immediately. Within hours, Portuguese authorities detained him while he attempted to board another private aircraft. When the news reached the FBI field office, no one celebrated. Instead, the room became strangely quiet. Agent Ross finally closed the investigation board that had dominated the wall for nearly a year. Every photograph had been removed. Every red string taken down. Every name accounted for. She looked toward Michael and me. It's over. Several months later, I stood alone on the front porch of my father's farmhouse. The evening breeze moved gently through the oak trees. The fields stretched peacefully toward the horizon. For the first time since my father's funeral, there were no reporters parked outside, no patrol cars, no lawyers carrying boxes of evidence, just silence. The kind of silence my father always loved. Michael walked over carrying a folder. The probate court signed the final order this morning. I opened it. The Carter farmland, all 180 acres, had officially been restored to my father's estate exactly as his will intended. Every fraudulent deed had been permanently removed from the county records. Every false lien had been canceled. Every forged document had been marked void. A few weeks later, I planted a young oak tree beside my father's grave. As I stood there, I remembered something he used to tell me whenever we worked the land together. A man's greatest inheritance isn't the land he leaves behind. It's the honesty he leaves in the people who protect it. For a long moment, I simply stood there in silence, because in the end, the land hadn't been saved by lawyers, or detectives, or judges. It had been saved because one honest man refused to let the truth be buried with his father. Thank you for staying with this story until the very end. If this journey reminded you that integrity is worth defending, no matter how difficult the fight, please let us know your thoughts in the comments. And if you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss our next true-to-life drama.